And then she was like dangling there on the lift.
Oh my God, that is so awful. It was so awkward.
Please take a moment to subscribe. Give this video a thumbs up. It truly helps this channel grow. I appreciate your support. Now let's dive into today's story.
$943,000. That's what I spent to fly my entire family to Turks and Caicos for 2 weeks. Private villa, first-class flights for all 11 of us, a private chef, excursions, everything. I didn't do it to show off. I did it because after 4 years of watching my own family slowly drift away from me since my accident, I thought foolishly that maybe the right gesture, the right gift, could finally bring us back together the way we used to be before a drunk driver changed the entire trajectory of my life in a single intersection. I found out on day 6 of that trip, sitting alone at the edge of the pool in my wheelchair, while the rest of my family swam without me, that money was never actually going to fix what was broken between us. I heard my younger sister first, her voice carrying easily across the water, doing an exaggerated impression of the way I have to angle myself to transfer from my chair into a pool lift, mimicking it for my brother, both of them laughing so hard my sister nearly went under. Girl, watching Simone try to get in the water is like watching a baby giraffe learn to walk, Ashley said, gasping between laughs. I love her, but Lord, it's a whole production. My brother Kendrick laughed even harder. At least she's got the money to make everybody wait around for the production. 900 grand, and we still gotta schedule pool time around her wheelchair situation. I sat there, in the wheelchair I've used every single day for 4 years, listening to my own siblings mock the exact body I've spent 4 years learning to live in with strength and grace, on a vacation I paid nearly $1 million for. And I felt something inside me that had been slowly cracking for years finally, completely break. What my family didn't know, sitting there laughing at the edge of that pool, was that this wasn't actually the first time. It wasn't even close to the 10th time. It was simply the time I finally fully understood exactly how little 4 years of my generosity, and 30 years of my love, had ever actually meant to them. Before I tell you exactly what I did after that pool, and exactly what I finally chose to do with my own life afterward, if you're new here, go ahead and hit subscribe because this story is worth staying for all the way to the end. Like this video if you believe every single person deserves to be treated with dignity, share it with somebody who's ever given more to their family than they ever received back, and drop a comment below telling me the time and the city you're watching this from. I read every single one, and I genuinely love seeing exactly how far these stories travel. Now let me take you back to the beginning, to the night for years before that pool, when my entire life changed in a single intersection, and to everything that happened quietly in the years that followed, that led me to that pool deck in Turks and Caicos in the first place. My name is Simone Carter, and I grew up in Houston, Texas, the middle child of 3, sandwiched between my older brother Kendrick and my younger sister Ashley in a household that, looking back now with considerably more clarity than I had as a child, had always quietly favored both of my siblings over me in small, difficult-to-name ways. My father, Gerald Carter, worked as a regional sales manager for most of my childhood, proud, image-conscious, the kind of man who cared deeply about how our family appeared to the outside world. My mother, Loretta, stayed home raising the 3 of us, warm in her own way, though I noticed, even as a young girl, that her warmth seemed to flow more easily and more consistently toward Kendrick and Ashley than it ever quite did toward me. I remember, specifically, a school talent show when I was around 10 years old, where I'd spent weeks practicing a piano piece I was genuinely proud of. My parents attended, along with Kendrick and Ashley, and afterward, in the car ride home, the conversation moved almost immediately to a minor academic achievement of Kendrick's from that same week, my own performance mentioned only briefly, almost as an afterthought, before the conversation shifted entirely away from me. I don't think my parents intended any particular cruelty in that moment, or in the countless similar moments that followed it throughout my childhood. I think simply that some children in a family become the default center of gravity, and others learn gradually to orbit around that center rather than occupy it themselves. I became, without ever consciously choosing it, the child who learned to seek attention and approval through achievement and, eventually, through generosity, rather than the child who received it freely, the way Kendrick and Ashley always seemed to. I don't say any of this to paint myself as some kind of tragic, unloved child. I had a reasonably happy childhood, by most external measures. But there was always a specific, quiet distance between myself and the rest of my family, when I spent most of my 20s trying to close through achievement, through generosity, through simply working harder than anyone else to earn a level of unconditional love that seemed to come so much more easily to my siblings. I built a successful marketing consulting firm in my late 20s, growing it steadily over several years into a genuinely profitable business, serving mid-sized companies across the Houston metro area. By the time I turned 30, I was earning more than both my siblings combined, and I used that success, in the specific way I now recognize as trying to buy my way into a closeness that should have simply existed on its own, to become the family's default source of generosity, covering my parents' mortgage payments during a difficult stretch, funding Ashley's wedding almost entirely, quietly helping Kendrick out of credit card debt on 2 separate occasions he never fully repaid. I told myself I did all of this out of love, and in the deepest, most honest part of myself, I believe that was mostly true. But I understand now, with the clarity that only comes from genuine hindsight, that some part of me was also always trying to purchase something that should never have required purchasing in the first place. For years before the events of this story, on an ordinary Tuesday evening driving home from a client meeting, I was stopped at a red light on Westheimer Road when a driver going nearly 60 miles an hour, later found to have a blood alcohol level well over 3 times the legal limit, ran the intersection and struck my car directly on the driver's side. I don't remember the impact itself. I remember waking up in an ambulance, disoriented, in more pain than I'd ever experienced in my entire life, and I remember a paramedic's careful, controlled voice telling me they needed to stabilize my spine before they could move me any further. I spent the following 11 days in intensive care, followed by 6 weeks of additional hospitalization, as doctors worked to address a spinal cord injury at the T10 level that would, they eventually confirmed once the swelling fully subsided, result in permanent paralysis below my waist. I would never walk again. I would spend the rest of my life using a wheelchair, a reality that took me considerably longer to fully accept than the doctor's careful, clinical explanations of my prognosis ever fully prepared me for. I remember the specific moment the lead neurologist delivered that final prognosis, roughly 3 weeks into my hospitalization, once the swelling around my spinal cord had subsided enough to give a definitive assessment. I remember asking her, my voice barely functioning, whether there was any chance, any possibility at all, of recovery. I remember her careful, compassionate honesty, explaining the specific nature of a complete injury at that vertebral level, and I remember a specific, hollow silence settling over me afterward that had nothing to do with physical pain, and everything to do with grieving an entire imagined future I would now never get to live. My family visited during that initial hospitalization, of course, my mother sitting beside my bed for hours those first difficult days, my father pacing the hallway outside in a barely contained anxiety I understood, even then, was as much about his own fear of what my injury meant for our family's image as it was genuine concern for my well-being. Kendrick and Ashley visited too, though I noticed, even through the fog of pain medication and shock, a specific discomfort in both of them that went beyond ordinary sibling worry. Something closer to a kind of quiet, unspoken embarrassment they never once said out loud, but that I felt anyway, in the careful way they avoided looking directly at my legs, in how quickly their visits tended to end. I didn't fully understand yet, lying in that hospital bed, exactly how much that quiet discomfort was about to define the following 4 years of my relationship with my entire family. The months following my discharge from the hospital were, by any honest measure, the hardest of my entire life. I relearned how to navigate my own home, my own business, my own basic daily routines, from an entirely new physical reality that required patience and grief and a specific kind of daily courage nobody fully prepares you for, no matter how many pamphlets a rehabilitation team hands you on your way out the door. What made those months even harder, though I didn't fully articulate it to myself until much later, was watching my own family slowly, quietly begin to distance themselves from me in ways that had nothing to do with logistics or genuine incapacity to help, and everything to do with an increasing discomfort around who I'd become. Family gatherings that used to happen at my parents' house, easily accessible with a single step at the front entrance, continued happening at that same house for the first year after my accident, despite my father's vague promises to install a ramp that never quite materialized. I attended those gatherings from my car in the driveway more than once, my mother or a cousin bringing food out to me, because nobody in my family seemed to consider it a priority to actually make the house I grew up in accessible to the daughter, who now used a wheelchair. Ashley's wedding, which I'd helped fund almost entirely 18 months after my accident, took place in a venue with a beautiful garden ceremony space accessible only by a long gravel path and a small set of stone steps. I watched most of my own sister's ceremony, the one I paid for, from a distance, unable to navigate closer, while my family, seemingly without much thought at all, simply accepted that as the unfortunate cost of an otherwise beautiful venue. I want to be clear that none of these individual moments, on their own, necessarily indicated deliberate cruelty. What became clear to me, slowly, painfully, over those first 2 years, was a consistent, exhausting pattern. My family's continued willingness to accept my financial generosity, alongside a persistent unwillingness to extend the far smaller effort of genuinely accommodating my physical reality, or more painfully, of simply treating me the way they always had before the accident, rather than with the careful, distant discomfort that had slowly become the family's default response to my presence. I want to be honest about something in this part of the story, because I think it matters to understanding everything that happened later at that pool in Turks and Caicos. I knew on some level that this pattern existed. I felt it. I noticed it. And I kept giving anyway, financially, generously, consistently, for reasons that took me a long time to fully understand about myself. Part of it, I think, was genuine love, a real, uncomplicated desire to support the people I'd grown up with, regardless of how imperfectly they'd learned to support me in return. But a larger part of it, I've come to understand through considerable therapy and considerable reflection in the years since, was something closer to a desperate hope that enough generosity, enough demonstrated value, might eventually earn back the easy, unconditional closeness I'd felt slipping away since that hospital bed 4 years earlier. I paid off my parents' remaining mortgage balance during my second year of recovery, a gift of nearly $200,000 that my father accepted with a brief, somewhat awkward thank you before quickly changing the subject to avoid. I now understand, having to sit with the discomfort of his disabled daughter being the one capable of rescuing his own finances. I covered the down payment on Kendrick's house the following year, another substantial gift he accepted readily, and mentioned exactly once at a subsequent family dinner, in a tone that made it sound almost like an achievement of his own rather than a gift from his sister. I funded Ashley's entire wedding, nearly $150,000 across the venue, catering, and her dress, watching much of the ceremony itself from a distance, because nobody had thought to ask whether the venue was actually accessible to the sister paying for it. Each individual gift in isolation might have simply been generous, unremarkable family support. Together, accumulated across 4 years, they represented not just an enormous financial commitment, but an enormous emotional one too. Years of hoping, quietly, that the next gift, the next gesture, might finally be the one that brought my family fully back to me. The way I remembered them being before the accident changed how they seemed to see me entirely. The idea for the Turks and Caicos trip came to me almost exactly a year before we actually took it, during a particularly difficult evening after a family dinner, where I'd once again watched my own relatives navigate around me at my parents' still unramped front entrance. A physical reality I'd simply, exhaustedly, made peace with accommodating myself year after year, because nobody else seemed inclined to. I thought, that night, driving home alone, about what it might take to finally create a moment substantial enough, generous enough, undeniably thoughtful enough, that my entire family might finally see me clearly again. Not as the sister and daughter whose wheelchair had become an inconvenient logistics problem to work around, but as the person I still fundamentally was underneath the accident that had changed my body but never, I believed then, changed who I actually was at my core. I planned that trip with the same careful, methodical attention I brought to every successful project in my consulting business. A fully wheelchair-accessible private villa on Providencials, one I personally verified through detailed correspondence with the property manager, confirming roll-in showers, appropriate doorway widths, A pool with a proper accessibility lift rather than the kind of afterthought accommodations I'd learned, painfully, to expect from most vacation properties. First-class flights for all 11 of us. My parents, Kendrick and his wife and their 2 children, Ashley and her husband, and 2 cousins who'd always felt more like siblings to me than distant relatives. A private chef for the full 2 weeks. Excursions built around genuine accessibility rather than requiring me to simply sit out the activities everyone else enjoyed, the way I'd grown so used to doing at countless family gatherings over the previous 4 years. The total cost, once everything was finalized, came to $943,000, a genuinely enormous sum, even for someone in my financial position, though I remember thinking, finalizing that budget, that I would have spent considerably more if it meant finally, truly closing the distance that had grown between myself and my family since that intersection on Westheimer Road. I announced the trip at a family dinner 8 months before we left, watching genuine excitement light up around the table, watching my mother cry happy tears, watching my father express a level of enthusiastic gratitude toward me that felt, for one brief, hopeful evening, like exactly the closeness I'd been quietly working toward for 4 entire years. I had no idea, sitting at that dinner table surrounded by my family's genuine excitement, exactly how differently that excitement would translate once we actually arrived on the island. The first 2 days of the trip felt, genuinely, like everything I'd hoped for. My family settled into the villa with obvious delight, marveling at the accessibility features I'd so carefully arranged, expressing gratitude that felt, in those early hours, entirely sincere. We had dinner together on the first night on a private terrace overlooking the water, and for a few hours, surrounded by genuine laughter and easy conversation, I let myself believe that this trip might actually accomplish exactly what I'd hoped it would. The cracks began appearing, subtly at first, on the 3rd day. We'd planned a snorkeling excursion that morning, one I'd specifically vetted for accessibility, confirming with the tour operator that their boat had a proper lift system, and that the reef site chosen was appropriate for a group that included a wheelchair user. The excursion itself went smoothly enough, but I noticed, watching my family prepare to board that morning, a specific impatience in Kendrick's tone as the boat crew worked through my boarding process. A process that took perhaps 10 additional minutes beyond what an able-bodied passenger would require. "We're gonna miss the best snorkeling light if this takes much longer," Kendrick said, not quite to me directly, but loud enough that I heard it clearly, standing beside the boat with his wife, checking his watch with visible irritation. I said nothing in that moment, choosing, as I so often had over the previous 4 years, to let the comment pass rather than create tension on what was supposed to be a joyful family trip. I told myself it was a minor moment, an isolated flash of impatience, rather than any real indication of how the rest of the trip might unfold. I understand now how much I'd trained myself, over 4 years, to minimize exactly these kinds of moments, to explain them away, to protect my family's comfort at the genuine expense of my own dignity. By the 5th day of the trip, the small moments of impatience I'd been quietly absorbing had begun accumulating into something considerably harder to explain away. Ashley made a comment at breakfast that morning, laughing as she said it, about how the villa's accessible pathway meant our group had to walk the scenic route to reach the beach rather than the more direct path only usable by someone without a wheelchair. Her husband laughed along with her. My mother offered a small, uncomfortable smile that told me she'd noticed the comment too, though she said nothing to address it. My father, that same afternoon, made an offhand remark to Kendrick about how expensive accessibility apparently was, gesturing vaguely toward the villa's various accommodations, in a tone that suggested resentment rather than gratitude, as though the very features that made the trip possible for me to fully participate in were somehow an unreasonable imposition, rather than the basic accommodation any thoughtful vacation planning should have included from the start. I began, around that 5th day, to notice something I'd perhaps been avoiding fully acknowledging for considerably longer than just this trip. An undercurrent, running beneath nearly every interaction with my family, that treated my disability not as a simple fact of my life to be accommodated with basic thoughtfulness, but as a persistent inconvenience my family tolerated specifically because of my financial generosity, rather than because they'd ever genuinely made peace with who I'd become. Since that accident, I found myself that evening, replaying countless smaller moments from the previous 4 years that I'd never fully examined together as a pattern. A Thanksgiving where I'd been seated at a separate, smaller table because my wheelchair didn't fit comfortably at the main dining table my parents had never bothered to reconfigure. A cousin's graduation party held on a second floor with no elevator, where I'd waited in the parking lot for over an hour, alone, while my family enjoyed the celebration upstairs, periodically sending down updates via text rather than any of them considering, even briefly, finding a way to include me directly. A Christmas morning gift exchange conducted almost entirely on the floor. By the fifth day of the trip, the small moments of impatience I'd been quietly absorbing had begun accumulating into something considerably harder to explain away. Ashley made a comment at breakfast that morning, laughing as she said it, about how the villa's accessible pathway meant our group had to walk the scenic route to reach the beach rather than the more direct path only usable by someone without a wheelchair. Her husband laughed along with her. My mother offered a small, uncomfortable smile that told me she'd noticed the comment too, though she said nothing to address it. My father, that same afternoon, made an offhand remark to Kendrick about how expensive accessibility apparently was, gesturing vaguely toward the villa's various accommodations, in a tone that suggested resentment rather than gratitude, as though the very features that made the trip possible for me to fully participate in were somehow an unreasonable imposition, rather than the basic accommodation any thoughtful vacation planning should have included from the start. I began, around that fifth day, to notice something I'd perhaps been avoiding fully acknowledging for considerably longer than just this trip. An undercurrent, running beneath nearly every interaction with my family, that treated my disability not as a simple fact of my life to be accommodated with basic thoughtfulness, but as a persistent inconvenience my family tolerated specifically because of my financial generosity, rather than because they'd ever genuinely made peace with who I'd become. Since that accident, I found myself that evening, replaying countless smaller moments from the previous 4 years that I'd never fully examined together as a pattern. A Thanksgiving where I'd been seated at a separate, smaller table because my wheelchair didn't fit comfortably at the main dining table my parents had never bothered to reconfigure. A cousin's graduation party held on a second floor with no elevator, where I'd waited in the parking lot for over an hour, alone, while my family enjoyed the celebration upstairs, periodically sending down updates via text rather than any of them considering, even briefly, finding a way to include me directly. A Christmas morning gift exchange conducted almost entirely on the floor around the tree, a physical arrangement I'd learned, wordlessly, to simply accept watching from a slight distance rather than ask my family to reconsider for my benefit. None of these moments, examined individually, had ever felt significant enough to raise as a formal grievance. Collected together, replaying in my mind that evening in the villa, they told a considerably clearer story than any single incident ever could have on its own. I didn't confront anyone directly during those early days. I told myself, the same way I'd told myself countless times over the previous 4 years, that I was perhaps being oversensitive, that vacation stress could explain small moments of irritation that didn't necessarily reflect anything deeper about how my family truly felt about me. I would understand, within the following 48 hours, exactly how wrong that particular self-reassurance actually was. Day 6 brought the moment that would ultimately define this entire trip, and in many ways, the following months of my life. I'd chosen to sit out an afternoon of pool time that day, feeling tired from the accumulated activities of the previous days, positioning myself in the shade at the edge of the pool deck with a book, close enough to remain part of the group's conversation without needing to navigate the pool lift for what felt, that particular afternoon, like more effort than I currently had energy for. My family, unaware I was close enough to hear clearly, or perhaps simply unconcerned about whether I could hear, began a conversation I wasn't meant to be part of. "Girl, watching Simone try to get in the water is like watching a baby giraffe learn to walk," Ashley said, her voice carrying easily across the water to where I sat, gasping between laughs as she said it. I love her, but Lord, it's a whole production. I felt my entire body go cold, hearing my own sister describe my careful, hard-won process of navigating a pool lift, a process I'd spent months relearning after my accident, one that required genuine strength and coordination I'd worked incredibly hard to develop. as some kind of clumsy comedy routine for her own entertainment. My brother Kendrick's laughter followed immediately, louder, crueler in a way that felt considerably less accidental than Ashley's initial comment. At least she's got the money to make everybody wait around for the production. 900 grand, and we still gotta schedule pool time around her wheelchair situation. I sat frozen at the edge of that pool deck, my book forgotten in my lap, listening to my own siblings mock, casually, cruelly, entertainingly for each other, the exact physical reality I'd spent 4 years learning to navigate with whatever grace and strength I could manage. On a trip I'd spent nearly $1 million funding specifically because I'd hoped, foolishly, that enough generosity might finally earn back some fraction of the closeness and respect I remembered feeling from my family. Before that intersection on Westheimer Road changed everything. I heard my cousin's wife, someone I'd always considered kind, offer a small, uncomfortable laugh of her own. Not quite defending me, not quite joining fully in the mockery, simply existing in that uncomfortable middle space that so many people occupy when they witness cruelty they're not quite brave enough to interrupt. Nobody in that pool, laughing at my expense, seemed to realize I could hear every single word. I sat with that moment for nearly 20 minutes before I moved, watching my family continue swimming, continuing their easy, laughing conversation, entirely unaware that something fundamental had just shifted permanently in how I understood my relationship with every single one of them. I didn't cry, though I expected I might. What I felt sitting there was something closer to a strange, clarifying calm. The specific calm that comes when a truth you've been avoiding for far too long finally, undeniably, presents itself with enough force that avoiding it any further simply becomes impossible. I wheeled myself back into the villa, found a quiet room away from the pool's noise, and sat with my own thoughts for the better part of an hour, methodically, the same way I'd approach any major decision in my consulting business, working through exactly what I now understood about the previous 4 years of my life, and exactly what I needed to do about it. I thought about the nearly $1 million I'd spent on this single trip alone. I thought about the mortgage payment, the down payment, the wedding, the countless smaller gifts and gestures I'd extended over 4 years, each one offered from a genuine desire to maintain closeness with people who, I now understood with painful clarity, had spent those same 4 years growing increasingly comfortable treating my disability as a source of private amusement, rather than simply a fact of my life deserving basic dignity and respect. I thought, too, about every single moment over those 4 years where I'd minimized my own hurt, explained away my own family's careless behavior, absorbed casual cruelty because confronting it directly felt, somehow, like it might cost me the very closeness I was so desperately trying to preserve. I made a decision, sitting alone in that quiet villa room, that would define not just the remainder of this vacation, but the entire trajectory of my relationship with my family going forward. I decided I was done. I gathered my entire family together that evening after dinner, in the villa's main living area, requesting calmly that everyone stay for a conversation rather than dispersing to their individual rooms the way the evening routine had settled into over the previous 5 days. I need to tell you all something I heard this afternoon, I said, my voice steadier than I expected, given how much emotion was sitting just beneath the surface of my own carefully maintained composure. I was at the edge of the pool. I heard every word of the conversation about my wheelchair, about the pool lift being a production, about my situation slowing everybody down. The room went silent in the particular way rooms go silent right before people fully understand they've been caught in something they assumed had gone entirely unnoticed. Ashley's face went pale. Simone, that was just, we were joking around, we didn't mean anything serious by it. You know how I get when I don't want to hear an explanation for why it was funny, I said, cutting her off with a firmness I hadn't used with my family in longer than I could remember. I want you all to actually sit with what you did. You mocked me. Mocked the exact physical reality I've spent 4 years learning to live with, learning to navigate with whatever dignity I could manage. On a trip I spent $943,000 funding specifically, because I hoped it might bring us closer together, not further apart. My father shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Simone, nobody's trying to minimize what you've been through. Your brother and sister just have a certain sense of humor. You know that about them. I do know that about them, I said. What I didn't fully let myself understand, until this afternoon, is exactly how much that sense of humor has apparently been directed at me, privately, for longer than just this trip. I want to know honestly right now, is this the first time you've all found my disability entertaining enough to joke about behind my back? Or is this simply the first time I happen to actually hear it? The silence that followed answered the question more clearly than any words could have. What followed over the next hour was one of the most painful, and ultimately clarifying, conversations of my entire life. As pieces of a pattern I'd only partially understood began surfacing in full, undeniable detail. My cousin's wife, the same woman who'd offered that uncomfortable laugh at the pool, finally spoke up, her voice shaking slightly. "Simone, I need to say something, because I don't think it's right for me to stay quiet anymore. This isn't the first time. I've heard comments like this at other family gatherings too, over the years. I should have said something sooner. I'm sorry I didn't." She went on to describe, carefully, several specific instances I'd never been aware of. Comments made about my wheelchair at family gatherings I hadn't attended. Jokes exchanged in a family group chat I wasn't included in. A running, casual thread of mockery that had apparently existed, quietly, parallel to the genuine gratitude my family expressed directly to my face whenever financial help was involved. My mother began crying. Though I noticed, even through her tears, a specific quality that felt more like distress at being caught than genuine remorse for the years of casual cruelty her children had apparently been engaging in. "I didn't know it went this far, Simone. I promise you I didn't know." "You knew enough," I said, and I meant it, thinking of 4 years of unramped entrances, of a wedding ceremony I watched from a distance, of countless smaller moments where the effort required to actually accommodate me seemed to consistently outweigh whatever love my family claimed to feel. You knew enough to notice when I wasn't there for parts of Ashley's wedding. You knew enough to see me sitting in my car outside your own house more times than either of us can count. You didn't need to hear the specific jokes to understand, on some level, exactly how comfortable this family had become treating my disability as an inconvenience to work around rather than a person to actually love unconditionally. Kendrick, to his credit, was the first to offer something that sounded like genuine, rather than defensive, accountability. "Simone, I don't have an excuse. I said something cruel, and I've apparently been saying things like it for longer than I want to admit to myself right now. I'm sorry. I know that doesn't undo it." I told my family something else that evening, something I'd never explicitly laid out for them before, though I suspect, on some level, most of them understood the general shape of it. The full financial picture of exactly what I'd given, quietly, consistently, over the 4 years since my accident. "Since the accident," I said, "I've given this family combined just over $1.4 million. The mortgage payoff, Kendrick's down payment, Ashley's wedding, countless smaller gifts none of you probably even remember individually, because they became so routine you stopped registering them as anything beyond what you'd simply come to expect from me. And now this trip, $943,000, spent specifically because I hoped foolishly, it seems now, that enough generosity might finally close a distance that had nothing to do with money at all, and everything to do with whether this family could actually see me as a full person again after my accident, rather than a wheelchair to be quietly, resentfully accommodated. I watched the specific number land differently across different faces in that room. My father's visible discomfort at hearing the full scope laid out so plainly, Ashley's genuine shock, suggesting she truly hadn't fully tracked the accumulated total of years of individual gifts she'd simply come to expect. "I'm not telling you this to make anyone feel guilty about accepting help," I continued. "I gave every single one of those gifts freely, because I loved you, and in many ways I still do. But I need every person in this room to understand something clearly. None of that generosity was ever supposed to be the price of basic dignity. I shouldn't have had to spend nearly $1 million to earn a vacation where my own siblings didn't mock my wheelchair behind my back. That's not a normal or acceptable exchange. And the fact that it took hearing you laugh about me at that pool to finally understand how deeply distorted this dynamic had become tells me exactly how much work I still need to do to actually value myself the way I deserve to be valued. I want to be honest that the remainder of that trip was considerably more subdued than the joyful reconnection I'd originally envisioned when I first started planning it, nearly a year earlier. I didn't leave the island early, though I considered it seriously during that first difficult night after the confrontation. I decided, instead, to stay, to use the remaining days as an opportunity to observe, clearly and without my previous willingness to minimize what I was seeing, exactly how my family chose to move forward in the aftermath of finally being confronted with the truth of their own behavior. Some of what I observed gave me genuine, cautious hope. Kendrick made a visible, consistent effort during the remaining days to check in with me directly, to ask, without my needing to prompt it, whether activities were genuinely accessible before assuming I'd simply sit out or slow the group down. My cousin's wife, the one who'd finally spoken up during that difficult conversation, became someone I found myself genuinely trusting more by the end of the trip than I had at its beginning. Her willingness to name an uncomfortable truth revealing a character I respected considerably more than the silence I'd grown used to from most of my family over the years. Other parts of that remaining week confirmed exactly the concerns that confrontation had first surfaced. Ashley, though outwardly apologetic, made several comments over the following days that suggested she still fundamentally viewed the incident as an overreaction on my part rather than a genuine, deserved reckoning with years of casual cruelty. My father spent much of the remaining trip in a kind of wounded, defensive silence that felt, to me, considerably more focused on his own discomfort at being confronted than on any real reflection about the pattern his children had apparently normalized within our family. I flew home from that trip with considerably more clarity than I'd left with, though it wasn't the clarity I'd originally hoped to find. I understood, by the time our plane landed back in Houston, that $943,000 had bought me something I hadn't initially expected it to. Not a closer family, but the undeniable, fully illuminated truth about exactly how far apart we'd actually grown. I made several significant decisions in the months following that trip, changes that reshaped my relationship with my family in ways I couldn't have fully predicted sitting at that pool deck on day 6. I stopped, entirely, the pattern of quiet, ongoing financial support I'd extended to my parents and siblings for 4 consecutive years. Not out of spite or punishment, though I understand some family members initially interpreted it that way, but because I finally, fully understood that continuing that pattern would simply continue enabling a dynamic where my generosity substituted for the genuine respect and accommodation I deserved as a baseline, rather than as something to be earned through nearly $1 million of demonstrated value. I began working seriously with a therapist who specialized in family dynamics and disability, someone who helped me understand, over the following months, exactly how much of my own self-worth I'd tied to my usefulness to my family, a pattern that had existed, I came to realize long before my accident ever occurred, though the accident had certainly intensified it considerably. I set clear, direct boundaries with each family member individually, conversations that range from genuinely productive, in Kendrick's case, to considerably more strained, particularly with my father and Ashley, both of whom struggled in different ways, to fully accept accountability for a pattern of behavior they'd apparently normalized without much genuine self-reflection. I also, during those months, began building something I hadn't fully realized I'd been missing for years: genuine friendships and community with other people navigating disability. Connections built on authentic understanding rather than the careful, exhausting performance of gratitude I'd grown so used to extending toward my own biological family. I joined a local organization supporting wheelchair users in the Houston area, eventually becoming close friends with several members whose own experiences of navigating an often inaccessible, occasionally unkind world resonated with my own in ways my family, despite 34 years of shared history, had never quite managed to. Of everyone in my family, Kendrick's response to that pool deck confrontation ultimately surprised me the most, evolving over the following year into something genuinely different from where our relationship had stood before that trip. He reached out several weeks after we returned from Turks and Caicos, asking if we could meet for coffee, just the two of us, a request that felt, initially cautiously hopeful rather than fully trusting, given how many years of accumulated small hurts had led to that pool deck moment in the first place. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said," he told me, during that first coffee meeting, about the mortgage and the down payment and everything else, and how none of us ever really sat with what it actually cost you, emotionally, to keep giving like that while we kept treating your disability like some kind of inconvenience. I think I convinced myself for a long time that because you never explicitly complained, everything was actually fine. I understand now that's not the same thing as things actually being fine. Over the following year, Kendrick made consistent, demonstrated efforts that felt considerably different from the kind of surface-level apology I'd grown used to receiving from various family members throughout my life. He researched accessibility requirements before suggesting any activities that included me. He directly addressed a cousin at a subsequent family gathering who made an offhand, careless comment about wheelchair accessibility being such a hassle to plan around, something I later learned about secondhand rather than witnessing myself. A detail that meant more to me than almost any direct apology could have. "I don't expect you to trust this overnight," he told me, roughly 8 months after that pool deck conversation. "I know I've got years of not showing up right to make up for. I just want you to know I'm actually trying now, not because I feel guilty about the money, but because I actually understand, finally, what I put you through." I believed him, cautiously, the way I've learned to believe most things now. Extending trust incrementally, based on consistent demonstrated behavior over time, rather than the immediate, hopeful trust one used to extend so freely, and so repeatedly, to people who hadn't yet earned it. Kendrick's wife, Danielle, became an unexpected part of that healing process too, reaching out to me directly several months after the trip to apologize for her own silence at the pool that day, and eventually becoming someone I speak with regularly, entirely independent of my relationship with my brother. "I should have said something when it happened," she told me once, during a lunch we now have semi-regularly. "I think I convinced myself it wasn't my place, since I married into this family rather than growing up in it. I understand now that watching cruelty happen and staying silent isn't actually neutral. I'm sorry it took me so long to understand that." My relationship with the rest of my family looks considerably different today than it did before that trip, shaped by each person's individual response to finally being confronted with years of accumulated harm. My relationship with Kendrick, as I mentioned, has genuinely strengthened, built now on a foundation of demonstrated respect rather than my previous, exhausting pattern of financial generosity substituting for actual emotional safety. My relationship with Ashley remains considerably more distant. She apologized, in the immediate aftermath of that confrontation, but her subsequent behavior over the following year suggested, repeatedly, that she viewed the entire incident as something she needed to apologize for rather than something she needed to genuinely understand and change. We speak occasionally now. At family gatherings I still sometimes attend, though I've stopped extending the kind of emotional investment toward that relationship that I once did so freely. My relationship with my parents occupies a complicated middle ground. My mother has made genuine, if imperfect, efforts toward better understanding, asking more questions now, before family gatherings about accessibility, checking in with actual curiosity rather than the performative concern I'd grown used to for years. My father, I'll be honest, has struggled considerably more, still carrying, I believe, more discomfort about being confronted with his own failures than genuine reflection about the pattern those failures represented. We maintain a relationship, though a noticeably more guarded one than we had before that trip. I no longer provide the kind of significant, ongoing financial support I once did, for any of them, a boundary I've maintained consistently despite occasional, subtle attempts by various family members to suggest I'm being unreasonably withholding. I remind myself, whenever that guilt threatens to resurface, of exactly what unconditional generosity purchased for me at that pool deck in Turks and Caicos. Not love, not respect, but simply years of quietly funded permission for my own family to treat my disability as an inconvenience to laugh about when they assumed I couldn't hear. I want to end this story not with the family reckoning itself, but with what I ultimately built in the space that reckoning created. Because I think that matters more than the confrontation alone. And because I think it's the part of this story most worth genuinely learning from. I redirected much of the financial generosity I once extended exclusively to my biological family toward a foundation I established roughly a year after that Turks and Caicos trip, focused specifically on funding accessibility renovations for newly disabled individuals and their families across the greater Houston area. Home ramps, accessible bathroom renovations, the exact kind of practical accommodations my own family had spent 4 years failing to prioritize for me, now extended to strangers who I've found, often express a level of genuine gratitude and understanding that felt, for years, painfully absent from my own family dynamics. I deepened my friendships within the local disability community significantly, building what I've genuinely come to think of as a chosen family. People who understand, without needing lengthy explanation, exactly what it means to navigate a world that wasn't originally built with us in mind. People who show up consistently, thoughtfully, without requiring nearly $1 million of demonstrated generosity, to treat me with basic dignity and respect. I also, in the 2 years since that trip, began speaking publicly about my experience, first at a small disability advocacy conference in Houston, later at larger events across Texas, sharing not just the story of the accident itself, but the far more complicated, painful story of navigating family dynamics after a life-altering disability. A story I've since heard echoed, in various forms, by countless other disabled individuals who've experienced their own versions of the exact dynamic I lived through at that pool deck. You don't owe anyone your dignity as payment for their basic decency, I tell audiences now, a line that's become something of a central message in the advocacy work I do. I spent nearly $1 million learning that lesson the hard way. I hope sharing it means at least a few of you learn it considerably faster, and considerably less expensively, than I did. 2 years removed from that pool deck in Turks and Caicos, I've rebuilt a life that looks considerably different from the one I was quietly, desperately trying to preserve during those 4 difficult years following my accident. My consulting business has grown further, in part because I've redirected the emotional energy I once spent managing my family's careful, exhausting comfort toward genuinely building something I'm proud of professionally. My foundation has funded accessibility renovations for over 60 families across Houston in less than 2 years, work that brings me a specific, grounded satisfaction that 4 years of desperately seeking my own family's approval never quite managed to provide. I still see my family, occasionally, at gatherings I choose to attend rather than feel obligated to attend, extending exactly as much emotional investment as feels genuinely safe and reciprocal, rather than the boundless, exhausting generosity I once offered so freely in hopes of earning something that should never have required earning in the first place. I think, often, about that moment at the edge of the pool, hearing my own siblings mock the body I've spent 4 years learning to live in with strength and genuine grace. I understand now that the moment wasn't actually the tragedy of this story, difficult as it was to live through. The moment was, in its own painful way, a gift, the exact clarifying truth I needed to finally stop pouring myself, and my resources, into relationships that had quietly, gradually stopped deserving either. I paid $943,000 for a family vacation that was supposed to bring us closer together. What it actually gave me, in the end, was considerably more valuable than any closeness I'd originally hoped to purchase. It gave me the clear-eyed truth about exactly who deserved my generosity, my presence, and my love, and exactly who had simply, quietly, been accepting all 3 without ever fully earning any of them. I wouldn't trade that truth, painful as it was to finally hear at the edge of that pool, for anything.
Thanks for tuning in and watching to the end. Drop your comments below.